A More Perfect Union, Obergefell versus Hodges and the Gay Rights Revolution. No union is more profound than marriage, for it embodies the highest ideals of love, fidelity, devotion, sacrifice, and family. Marriage embodies the love that endures even past death. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote these words in Obergefell versus Hodges' majority opinion, and Jim Obergefell repeated them in each of the 9 wedding ceremonies he performed since the 2015 decision. The officiant did not seek fame, but rather simple recognition on his late husband's death certificate. John Arthur, Obergefell's partner for over 20 years, would have been labeled single in death if the Supreme Court upheld the Ohio Constitution's rejection of same-sex marriages. Obergefell was not a militant activist in this fight. He was a solitary widower, a pensive man who made love and loss seem transcendent, not gay or straight, but infinitely human. He was an ideal litigant for establishing same-sex couples' right to marry, winning the most significant battle in LGBT+ history. His loss mirrored the losses that devastated the gay community during the AIDS crisis, mobilizing again to fight back where the federal government fell short. The Obergefell legal team effectively utilized financial support and sympathetic plaintiffs for victory at the Supreme Court, capitalizing on strategies that the gay rights movement had honed over almost a century of activism. Pictured here, you see some of the 33 gay men and women, 7 of their children, a funeral director, and an adoption agency who sued their respective states over denial of their 14th Amendment rights, violated when they were refused the right to marry in their state and/or have their marriages from other states recognized. A strategic sense of immediacy expedited the process, urging this case through the courts. Jim Obergefell petitioned when his husband was dying of ALS, knowing that Ohio would not recognize their marriage on John Arthur's death certificate. Just 2 years prior, U.S. v. Windsor had established federal recognition of gay marriages, invalidating the Defense of Marriage Act because DOMA undermines both public and private significance of state-sanctioned same-sex marriages, for it tells those couples and all the world that their otherwise valid marriages are unworthy of federal recognition. Obergefell sought to apply the same logic to the 13 states that banned same-sex marriage. Ohio had a celebration law, meaning that for most marriages, if it was performed legally in another state, Ohio recognized it. This applied to cases of cousin and underage marriages, for example. However, Ohio's constitution specifically banned the performance or recognition of same-sex marriages, so the Ohio defendants' relationships were excluded from this celebration law. This provided standing to petition for a writ of certiorari, taking the case to the highest court in the country. Obergefell was not the first time the gay community mobilized around a common cause to petition the federal government on a matter of life and death. In fact, Jim Obergefell lost friends to a disease that mimicked his husband's. AIDS spread in staggering numbers throughout the 1980s as men embraced the same-sex rights that had been slowly afforded in the civil rights era. Many gay men bristled at requests to curb their sexuality or wear prophylactics to prevent infection because it inhibited the freedoms they had finally won. Though the Reagan administration ignored the issue both publicly and financially, organizations like Lambda Legal and ACT UP successfully lobbied the FDA to approve 4 new drugs to combat the virus and its effects. As Radical Faeries co-founder Arthur Evans said, they had to have institutional continuity and revolutionary energy. They combined the rationality of the Enlightenment with the vigor of a popular uprising. Over the past 10 years alone, HIV infection rates have dropped by almost 20% among gay and bisexual men, though AIDS has taken the lives of 448,000 people since its emergence in 1983. John Arthur's ALS worked similarly to AIDS, slowly and brutally deteriorating the body. On the day of his wedding, at over 6 feet tall, he weighed 100 pounds. In those final weeks, a friend mistook his 100.2 weight for a blood pressure reading. The neurodegenerative disease is characterized by increasing paralysis that ultimately spreads to vital organs and kills the patient. Lou Gehrig's disease, as ALS was traditionally known, was masculinized by the fact that it was named for a renowned baseball player. Unlike HIV and AIDS, it did not carry sexual stigma or moral judgment. Though it's a clinical analysis in the case of a heartbreaking situation, the fact that ALS rather than AIDS widowed Obergefell made him a more sympathetic plaintiff. As Obergefell noted, I think John's and my story resonated with people. Everyone loves someone and everyone loses someone they love. I think the fact that we had a compelling story made it real for people across the country, and that had a big part in changing hearts and minds not just in courtrooms, but also of our fellow Americans. Though James Obergefell became the named plaintiff by happenstance, being the first to submit his petition, he provided the ideal face for the case. Michael Nestling, a member of the 1980s Grand Fury Artist Collective, noted that white men were uniquely equipped to lobby for change in the gay revolution. "We're middle-class white guys. We're not used to being ignored, and so what can we do to get what we want? And what we want is for other people to know what's going on." Obergefell was white, single, 49 years old, of medium build. The only gay plaintiff who was not part of a couple, he spoke alone, minimizing pictures of affectionate same-sex couples or with families at the heart of the case. Massachusetts was the first state to establish gay marriage, a precedent set by its courts and expanding to 37 states through legislative and judicial action by the time Obergefell went to the Supreme Court in 2015. However, in that time, 13 states explicitly banned gay marriage, and the federal government passed the Defense of Marriage Act to attempt to limit marriage to heterosexual couples. Widower Jim Obergefell was uniquely situated to tug at the legal and emotional heartstrings of the American public and change the tide of homophobic public opinion. While traditional views of marriage were evolving, the revolution was slow and best suited to a figurehead who did not discomfort audiences. As you see on the left, during oral arguments, Obergefell dressed in a conservative suit with a plaid shirt and tie, different from the lavender bow tie and equality pin that he wore the day the court announced its decision. This change in apparel reflected Obergefell and his lawyers' cultivation of a sympathetic plaintiff, as well as the historical significance of clothing in the gay rights movement. In the early 20th century, gaudy suits, red neckties, and perfume handkerchiefs were a safe way to signal sexual orientation to other men. Masquerade balls in New York City provided safe cover for homosexual relationships. These cultural practices fostered a community of bold sartorial choices that continue to be a hallmark of modern gay culture. As the lawyers and plaintiffs sought to emphasize how similar they were to other Americans, however, these hallmarks took a back seat. Robert Duncan's 1944 Beat Poet Manifesto argued that gay rights were human rights, but separatism did not accomplish the movement's goals. Majority culture balked at homosexual attitudes. Duncan criticized the cultivation of a secret language, a camp, a tone, and a vocabulary that are loaded with contempt for the uninitiated, designating all who are not wise to homosexual ways, filled with an unwavering hostility and fear, gathering an incredible force of exclusion and blindness. Obergefell's stylistic discretion in front of the undecided Supreme Court held with Duncan's assertion, representing an image of affluence and majority culture that he had cultivated with his husband. John Arthur came from a wealthy family, his mother buying a Victorian mansion for her son and his partner when they moved in together in Cincinnati, a city with an ordinance explicitly forbidding protections for homosexuals. The lavish purchase was reminiscent of gay New Yorkers who, finding increased criminalization of their lifestyle in the 1930s, used the power of their New York dollars during their Depression to buy property from the small, wary straight community that was on Fire Island. Obergefell and Arthur were tastemakers, traveling abroad, hosting lavish parties, and patronizing local artists. Arthur had Velcro shirts tailored and paid for in-home care when his health deteriorated. Wealthy friends helped finance the $14,000 medical flight to get married on a Maryland tarmac in Arthur's final weeks. Likewise, when the Human Rights Campaign Fund formed as the first prominent political action committee to support gay rights, heirs to corporate windfalls like James Hormel and Dallas Coors financed its efforts. They transformed the gay rights movement from the leather-clad SDS alums of the Gay Liberation Front to an elite club of the richest gay men in America. The HRC successfully lobbied for federal funding to fight the AIDS crisis and discriminatory hiring practices decades before it financed efforts in Obergefell versus Hodges, demonstrating that maneuvering from within the political system was more effective than protesting from outside of it. The 16 couples who joined Obergefell in the case came from diverse but similarly successful backgrounds. One couple met in veterinary school. Another was a pair of nurses. Joe Vitale was an insurance salesman. Pam Yorksmith and her wife Nicole ran a technology consulting company and worked in human resources. Valeria Tanko and Sophie Jesty were professors. Many of the couples had adopted children, 7 of whom were named explicitly in the case. According to American Adoptions, the largest adoption agency in the country, it costs between $30,000 and $40,000 to adopt a child. These affluent, white, black, and Hispanic plaintiffs represented complaints from Sixth Circuit states of Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Other federal circuits had ruled in favor of same-sex marriage recognition, so when the Sixth Circuit ruled against the plaintiffs, it provided a conflict into which the Supreme Court was more likely to wade. Ultimately, the Sixth Circuit Court loss was a victory because it ushered same-sex marriage to the Supreme Court. The national effort also brought in more financial backing from support groups like the Human Rights Campaign and Lambda Legal, resulting in the mobilization of 148 amicus curiae, including one signed by 379 employers, asserting their companies are better served by a uniform marriage rule that gives equal dignity to employee relationships. Allowing same-sex couples to marry improves employee morale and productivity, reduces uncertainty, and removes the wasteful administrative burdens imposed by the current disparity of state law treatment. The plaintiffs' financial success mirrored many businesses' belief in the value of an inclusive workplace. Obergefell versus Hodges legalized same-sex marriage across the United States. However, the majority opinion has been both lauded and criticized. The media cheers Justice Kennedy as the first gay Supreme Court justice because of his opinion, but legal scholars criticize it for emphasizing sentimental rather than legal arguments. As Ruth Ann Robson notes, it would be difficult to argue that Justice Kennedy's opinion for the court in Obergefell versus Hodges is doctrinally rigorous. She posits that had Ruth Bader Ginsburg written for the majority, she would have remedied this shortcoming by more substantially elucidating a 14th Amendment due process and equal protection argument. In an opinion that would have been more doctrinally rigorous, it would have been less sentimental, and it would have had jurisprudential integrity. Neglecting those standards puts the case at risk of being overturned by a more conservative court. Kennedy's reliance on a substantive due process argument composed of vacuous, pseudo-sophisticated aphorisms regarding the 14th Amendment is contrary to all evidence of historical understandings at the time the amendment was adopted, argues University of St. Thomas Law School professor Michael Stokes Paulson. This historiography further supports the power of a sympathetic plaintiff, since emotion seemingly won over the swing vote rather than a democratic or constitutional argument. The Obergefell lawyers played on emotion in their brief, referring to Obergefell and Arthur as a couple who fell deeply in love before tragedy struck, and because Ohio would not permit them to marry, family and friends opened their hearts and wallets so the couple could travel to Maryland on a medically equipped plane and marry there. It was a joyous moment, but cruelly short-lived. This emotional brief shows Kennedy's majority opinion mirrors its sentimental approach. Precedent and standing are integral components of success at the Supreme Court, but lawyers can more easily capitalize on them if they are seated with a sympathetic plaintiff. The Supreme Court's decision to deny states the right to treat gay men and women as second-class citizens was the culmination of almost a century of activism. Jim Obergefell did not see it that way, but rather that John's and my fight is about love, dignity, rights, and respect. Nothing more, nothing less. Regardless, their fight legitimized not only their own 21-year relationship, but the preamble's commitment to form a more perfect union.